Can I introduce our next speaker, Geoffrey Shannon? Everybody, I think, in the room knows Geoffrey. Geoffrey is best, I think, he has a long CV in this area, but I think it's summarised by one simple statement. He is one of the strongest advocates for children's rights in this country. He has achieved an enormous amount through all of his work, and we're delighted that he's able to present today. Over to you, Geoffrey.
Firstly, I have to say it's a sort of hard act to follow. And everything I was going to say, you have said. So all I'm going to be doing is padding to really what you've said, because you've really pulled out all of the key issues, and I'm greatly in your debt and really in your shadow in the context of the outstanding presentation. I don't think there's anybody in this room that hasn't been struck by all of the key themes that you have brought up. These are themes, certainly with my colleague Nora Gibbons, when we looked at the deaths of children in care, these are themes that emerged again and again. The issue about the voice of the child, the invisibility of children, care planning, including children in care planning. All of those themes were themes that are recurrent themes. And that is really the title of my presentation. And I do feel it's the measure of any democracy is the manner in which the needs of the most vulnerable are considered or met. I think we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get this right. I think it's incumbent upon everybody to work together to ensure that we get the best possible agency. I would like to publicly be associated with the comments of Paul in relation to the Minister's role. I think she's been an outstanding minister in bringing about a constitutional referendum which has eluded us for 2 decades. As somebody who's been campaigning with others in this room for a referendum, to see this referendum over the line, I think will have a huge difference and will really put it up to the HSE and to all of those who work in the system to do better, because we have to do better. And it's not a question of being complacent, because the deficits are in the here and now. And it would be very sobering to say it's all in the past, because we had a report last week, a report published by HICWA into the Dublin North West LHA area. And we'd all like to say that, it's all fine now and that this agency will fix everything. It won't fix everything. I think what it will do is we have a new dedicated agency which will provide a renewed framework to deal with some of the key issues that have, eluded us. And the task force report, I think, also provides a roadmap. We have a dedicated Department of Children and Youth Affairs, and I'd like to acknowledge the outstanding work of the Secretary-General who's here this morning, in terms of it's been really a challenging time to get this referendum over the line. To establish an agency within such a tight time frame is hugely challenging. But starting off, I suppose, my own presentation, learning from the past, embedding a children's rights approach. In my opinion, nothing predicts like the past. Those who are unaware of history are bound to repeat it, and there appears to have been a failure to learn from past mistakes. And if we turn back the clock 7 days and we look at the HICWA report from last week, we see that there was no evidence that lessons from the past had been learned in respect of certain aspects. That means that this is something that we're continuing to struggle with. And I think, as I was saying, I think unless we learn from our past experiences, we're going to repeat those mistakes into the future. And that's where I feel that this agency will make a difference. And I think this agency has the capacity to bring all of those lessons from the past together. And I don't want this morning to be overly negative. I think this is really a positive day. And I'd also like to acknowledge the outstanding work undertaken by social workers in the area. And sometimes it's easy to criticise those at the front line in relation to the work. In my work in the adoption area, I've seen the outstanding work undertaken by social workers, and I just want to acknowledge that publicly. But how do we move forward? Well, we move forward by taking a rights-based approach. And how do we take a rights-based approach? Well, I think we should consider the Convention on the Rights of the Child, with particular attention to the 4 general principles underpinning that convention. And that's back to basic principles. And what are those? Non-discrimination, the best interest principle as a primary consideration, the right of every child to life, survival and development, and most importantly, and we heard it from Casey and Noel in powerful terms, hearing the voice of the child. Because if you ask me, what is the common denominator across all of the reports? It's been the failure to hear properly the voice of the child. So these are the key obligations that the agency must fulfil. But the role of the agency will be in terms of protection. And Article 19 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child imposes duties on the state to protect children in strong, unequivocal terms. So what we need is a positive, mandatory duty to promote the welfare of children not receiving adequate care and attention. And let's look at all of the reports, say the report that both Nora and I undertook. What troubled me about that, and what troubled Nora and all of those people who have drafted reports, was that risk indicators were not followed up. Again, if we turn back to the HICWA report published last week, we see serious defects in the risk management process. And that is worrying. And I suppose what struck me in the context of my work on the child death report, and Fiona touched on it from Alcohol Ireland, is the issue that alcohol was not perceived as a risk indicator. And it's really what we perceive as the risk indicator. What are the issues? What are the red flag issues that should trigger us to intervene? And it's finding that balance between supporting families and intervening to protect children. And that is a skill that I think we're going to have to fine-tune. Also, the child protection notification system we see last week was not compliant with Children First. Now, I'm aware of the fact that a new child protection notification system is to be rolled out this year, and that is to be welcomed. So a lot of the issues we're talking about is taking a proactive, positive approach to protecting children. And sometimes it's not about resources, because many of the failings in our child protection system have come back to practice failings. So the poor standard of record keeping, weakened passive management. And I'd like to acknowledge the work, very positive work, that Mr. Jays has undertaken since taking over as the National Director. We now have a new structure. We have the National Director for regional service directors, 17 child and family area managers, and we have, I suppose, a new framework for service delivery. All of that's very positive. It's a new structure. And the Minister, I just want to come back to something the Minister said, because I think it's very important and hugely important. The Minister made reference to poor interagency cooperation and cooperation, and she is absolutely right. That is one of the biggest failings within our child protection system, is the failure of people to work together to protect children. And I think that that's something that we're all going to have to work on. And it's not just a question of blaming the Health Service Executive, it's all of the agencies. Health Service Executive is only one point of contact. So it starts from the moment that there is the potential risk to a child. And again, coming back to the child death report in terms of taking a positive, proactive approach to child protection, what we need is greater links between child welfare and protection services and child and adolescent mental health services. And what struck me in the context of the child death report was you had child psychiatry professionals involved in the less severe cases, while inexperienced social workers were working unsupervised with the most serious cases. In my opinion, the system fails many of those children experiencing psychological or mental health difficulties. The failure to recognise mental health issues at an early stage can have a profound impact on the child. Warning signs need to be treated with sufficient seriousness. And I suppose our chair is a real expert in this area. But it's an area I feel passionately about, is children with psychological or mental health difficulties. Because I think we've failed those children. Referrals need to be timely and effective. And we need to be proactive. So I'm hoping that the vision for this agency, that this agency will be in a position to bring all of the key stakeholders together to robustly address the issues and challenges facing those children with mental health issues. And we need to be proactive. We need to take a really positive approach, and that comes down to information management systems. We need a system for managing information in respect of each child. Practical example of that, in terms of, I suppose, the review of the deaths of children into carers, is that families moving must be tracked if there are child protection concerns. Because certainly my experience in reviewing the files is that some children moved with their families to another area and disappeared off the radar. That should not happen. And that's when we talk about the principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is one of being proactive, one of taking a positive approach to child protection. When a child is taken into care, an assessment of that child's needs must be carried out. And again, coming back to where we're at now, if we look at the review of the adequacy for child and family services, we see 593 children in care did not have a care plan. Now, that is troubling. And again, that is a practice issue. Because if you haven't a care plan, there's no roadmap as to where that child is going in the care system. That child ends up drifting. And our system must focus on being proactive and not reactive. Because I think when it's reactive, there isn't the time to prepare the care plan. I think there should always be time to prepare a care plan. And placements must meet the individual needs of the child. A practice issue, but nonetheless hugely important. And again, we see it in the context of the Hickel report last week. This was an issue. We see that there were problems with appropriate matching and the availability of placements. And that brings me to the foster care issue. And Noel referred to that. I think it's hugely important. I'd like to say that foster parents are ordinary people doing extraordinary work on the part of the state. I think we need to support them. I think we need to do more to recruit foster parents. And how that is done, I think, is going to be hugely challenging. So there is a tendency, when a report such as the Hickel report publishes last week, that to rubbish foster care, to say it's all bad. In fact, what we have is a small number of cases where there were difficulties. And I think what we need to do, the real positive aspect of our system, is the fact that children have the opportunity of growing up in a very positive fashion in foster families. And, I commend foster care in the strongest possible terms. And family support, key in terms of, again, coming back to the principles of the Convention. Article 19 is one which takes a rights-based approach. It's about proactive prevention. And I think the best place for a child to grow up is within his or her family. In my opinion, we need to do much more to support families. Family support ranks, in my opinion, and has ranked historically as a poor third to child protection and alternative care in the battle for resources and professional time. And what we need to do is to make sure that we deal with the emerging crisis before it becomes a crisis. So it makes sense. And in fact, there is an obligation on us. And a number of decisions of the European Court of Human Rights have emphasised that taking a child into the care system should be really a measure of last resort. And that is that the growing trend over the last year. There have been 4 decisions of the European Court of Human Rights on this issue. So I think the referendum proposal is a very positive step, because I suppose it's a measure in the referendum provision dealing with child protection is one which protects and vindicates the rights of children. The threshold post a referendum, once the legislation is commenced, will be on the effects of the failure on the child rather than the reasons for the failure. And I think the nature of the failure is more clearly defined, and the approach is much more consistent with the provisions in the international treaties. And what is required is a failure of duty to such extent that the safety or welfare of any child is likely to be prejudicially affected. And that phrase, likely to be prejudicially affected, was subject to much debate. And what does it really mean? Well, what it means is, given the required harmonious interpretation of this provision with other provisions in the Constitution relating to the family, this will not result in the decisions of marital parents being undermined unless there is a significant threat to the welfare or safety of the child. But what I think this referendum, rolling out this referendum proposal, will mean for the HSE is that it will require and empower the state to intervene at an earlier stage to ensure problems are resolved before they become serious and intractable. So there is not only does it make sense, but in my opinion, there will be a constitutional mandate on the HSE to invest more robustly in family support services. And then another legal instrument which we are bound by is the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms. And that provision has one specifically dedicated to children's rights and talks about the best interest principle and talks about a principle that Michael from belong to, and again another organisation doing outstanding work on behalf of children, referred to as this principle of equality. This is absolutely key, whether it's in the context of LGBT young people, whether it's in the context of traveller children, whatever the situation is, our system must treat all our children equally. And I think that the impetus for that will improve post a referendum. And coming then to look at what would be the consequences of the referendum for the agency, I think they'd be quite profound, because the potential impact of the 31st Amendment to the Constitution, in my opinion, will be as follows, is that it certainly presupposes a stronger commitment to the independent rights of children. The Constitution will require the state to provide for law for the best interests of the child. So we're now reflecting in our Constitution what really exists in international law in strong terms. And if we look at the reference to children's rights as natural rights, I think that has an important implication. And the implication is as follows, is that it states very clearly that child rights apply to every child in Ireland. The rights apply to both citizen and non-citizen children. That does not mean that non-citizen children will be entitled to remain in Ireland if they are not already entitled to remain here. But what it will mean is that the state must ensure that children receive protection and care, and every effort is made to ensure that a child is reunited with his or her family. And while the referendum proposal doesn't enumerate the rights of children, the Convention on the Rights of the Child may be used as a helpful guide by the court, as it has been in the case of Nola versus the Minister for Justice. Also, the European Convention on Human Rights may be helpful, as it has been in Doyle versus the Commissioner of Garda Síochána. So I think the courts have a real opportunity here. And I do feel, in the context of the court system, that there have been improvements. The new President of the District Court has introduced a practice direction that will ensure uniformity in childcare cases in the Dublin area, and I accept some of the criticisms levelled this morning. I think that those will have to be addressed robustly. Coming back then to the issue that Michael raised on equality, will the referendum make a difference? I think it will make a very significant difference, because while the new provision does not expressly state that all children should be treated equally, it is implicit. Because if you look at the referendum proposal, the first provision, Article 42.8.1, talks about all children. The remaining sections refer to any child. The provision dealing with state intervention talks about parents regardless of their marital status. So it implies that the new constitutional dispensation affirms equality. Coming back to an issue that was touched on by Casey and Noel, the core issue of the access. And you're absolutely right when you talk about it. Access is a right of the child and should not be denied unless there's clear evidence that is contrary to the welfare of the child. Coming back to last week's report, we see that 41% of the children who were placed in foster care were placed in foster homes outside of the local health area, which makes access very difficult. And there is a decision of the European Court of Human Rights on this, a case called Olsen versus Sweden. And in that case, you had 3 children from the Olsen family were placed in foster families at a considerable geographical distance from each other. As a result of the geographical distance, and the type of stuff you were talking about, is a contact between the parents and the children and between the children themselves became virtually impossible. And the European Court of Human Rights held that this was a breach of the right to respect for private and family life. Well, what does Sweden say? And Sweden is one of the good guys. Sweden is one of those states that we all look to. But Sweden said we can't recruit enough foster families. What did the European Court of Human Rights say? It said not good enough. Is that it held against Sweden, notwithstanding the administrative difficulties in recruiting appropriate foster parents. I think there's a real lesson there to be learned for, I suppose, the health service executive when it's placing children. because of the fact that Article 8 guarantees the right to respect for private and family life, guarantees that access is a right of the child and should not be denied unless there is clear evidence that is contrary to the welfare of the child. And the need for protection in this area is even greater than any other area. So children can keep in contact with each other, can keep in contact with their parents, even if children are in care. That level of contact, I think, is hugely important, because there is a positive mandatory obligation on the state to ensure that children can remain in contact with each other. But if you ask me what is the issue that I think is the most important issue, and it's the issue that was touched on by Noel and by Casey, and it was the issue of the voice of the child. What struck me in the context of the child death report was the sheer invisibility of children within the social work case files. And as a result of that, children suffered abuse. My view is that no child should suffer abuse to protect his or her abusive parents. No child should be made to live a life of unspeakable abuse or neglect because just his voice or her voice hasn't been heard. And I think we need to do much better in terms of hearing the voice of the child. And you gave us some great ideas. Post the referendum, there will be mandatory obligations on the various agencies to ensure that the voice of the child is heard. The state will have to introduce legislation, so we will have an enhanced, a more heavily entrenched right for children to be listened to, an enhanced culture of listening to children. It's not just changing law, it's about changing attitudes and changing exactly what you've said. And I wish all of that presentation was circulated to all of those who work in the childcare area, because there's so many powerful messages there that could very usefully be implemented on a daily and on a practical type of basis. So how do we hear the voice of the child, and how sometimes it becomes very abstract? Well, it will depend on the precise level of maturity of the child, but nonetheless we should, if at all possible, hear children directly where that is feasible. And I think that the referendum will actually bring about significant change in this area. And there are real challenges where children have mental health issues, for example. I think the referendum implicitly presupposes that children will not always be in a position to express their views, but that does not absolve the agency or the state from the responsibility of hearing those children. They are nonetheless entitled to be heard. Coming back to children, how we view children. Child's a person, not a name or number. Child's a person, not an object of concern. And when we're shaping our child protection system into the future, we should have that in our respective minds, because I think that will give us some inkling. How will we judge this agency? We will judge this agency on better outcomes for children, that Ireland will be a better and brighter future for the children of Ireland. As I was saying, learning from the past, those who are unaware of history are bound to repeat it. Hugely important message. So in conclusion, I suppose, what would I like to see, or what would, in summary, would be the changes I'd like to see? I think the impact must be more than just a name change, a change in the payslip that each social worker gets once the agency is fully commenced. It must be about a new vision, new organisational change. I think that's hugely important. The system must be accountable and transparent. I think that that's a key part of this, and there must be a monitoring system. Organisational change is about what the organisation stands for and believes in. I think we should adopt a rights-based approach to implementation, which makes clear how children should be treated. Thank you very much.